Hello, my name is Nigel Thorne. I'm from Wales, and I have concerns about third-party organisations that will be influencing Welsh children's education. One such organisation is Brook Cymru, a Welsh offshoot of Brook, who describe themselves as sexual health and well-being experts. Brook have worked closely with Professor Emma Reynolds from Cardiff University, who is a huge advocate of queer theory, a praxis-driven philosophy that aims to undermine social norms. In January, Brook Cymru tweeted that they had started their partnership with Central South Consortium and are now training teachers in the local authority areas of Bridgend, Cardiff, Merthyr Tydfil, Rhondda Cynon Taf and Vale of Glamorgan. In February 2023, the Central South Consortium published a newsletter for teachers entitled Curriculum for Wales. The newsletter advertised drop-in sessions and also advertised professional learning events to be delivered by Brook Learn. Before exploring the type of training that Brook provide, it is worth recapping on queer theory and how it has influenced relationships and sexuality education in Wales. The word gender wasn't used to refer to humans at all until the start of the 20th century. It then came into use when the word sex became synonymous with sexual intercourse, as a polite synonym for sex. Partly it is claimed to stop men answering yes please to the question sex on official forms.
Okay, name, Austin Danger Fowlers. Sex? Yes, please.
In the 1950s, a new definition of the word was created, originating in the United States. This defined gender as the social expectations of the roles and behaviours of an individual based on their sex.
As children, there is no limit to what we believe we can become. But as girls and boys, we are steered in different directions growing up. This happens because of what we call gender stereotypes, traditional ideas about what boys and girls can or should do. They may not always be obvious, but stereotypes are everywhere, and they start to follow us from our earliest days in the toy store, and continue to influence us when choosing subjects at school.
In 1990, American academic Judith Butler published her seminal work, Gender Trouble, a work influenced by French post-structuralist philosophers, in particular the writings of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. In her work, Butler postulates that within society there is a heterosexual matrix, a social expectation that boys will be masculine and sexually attracted to girls, and girls will be feminine and sexually attracted to boys. In order to break down this matrix, Butler proposes the dissemination of teaching that downplays the significance of biological sex and elevates the significance of a personal gender. Indeed, Butler claims that gender is performed, and a gender identity is created as a result of performing that gender. Her ideas have proven to be massively influential in academic circles. In an interview with American academic Derek Jensen, Susan Cox explained.
So, Derek, you're certainly right in that there has been this massive coup in academia of queer theory, and we see it pretty much everywhere, especially in feminism today. So, queer theory basically problematizes what's called the binary opposition. For example, man versus woman. Queer theory argues that binary oppositions are inherently hierarchical, in that one term is privileged over the other as the primary, and the other term is merely its deviant or derivative. For example, man is primary and woman is merely the negation of man. For example, in psychoanalysis, women were theorized as being merely the lack of the penis. So queer theory argues that we need to deconstruct all of these social binary oppositions, for example, man versus woman, heterosexual versus homosexual, natural versus artificial, nature versus culture. And we do this through the strategy of queering. And queering is basically a strategy of conceptual and categorical border transgression, in which each category becomes essentially meaningless and not distinct from the other. For example, if we take man and redefine man as not being a male person, but whoever feels like a man, then we've queered that category and is no longer distinct from woman. And this is seen as a progressive movement in getting rid of social oppression. Because queer theory views oppression as springing not from one class of people subordinating another and exploiting them for labor and resources for their material benefit, but oppression comes from this very act of labeling these groups in a binary fashion, which is seen as restrictive and oppressive, and people cannot express their authentic selves in this binary opposition. So when oppression is seen not as arising from these material relations of power, these class relations, but instead the labeling of these relations in a binary fashion, of putting people into these groups of categories, then it really drops power out of the equation. For example, Judith Butler, in her seminal text, Gender Trouble, which came out in 1990, at the beginning of the third wave of feminism and was hugely influential to the third wave, she argues that patriarchy is, she celebrates the fact that the term patriarchy has lost currency in recent feminist theory, and that we cannot identify males as a class as the oppressors of females, because this is too totalizing a gesture. And actually, this is not how it works, but oppression springs from these discursive structures of binary oppositions. And if we identify males as the oppressor class, that only works to strengthen the binary opposition.
In 2014, Ruth Hunt from Cardiff took over the helm at Stonewall, the LGBT rights charity. Hunt had studied Judith Butler at university. She is not adverse to being less than transparent. After receiving a grant of $100,000 from the Arcus Foundation, in 2015, Hunt proceeded to queer the male-female and hetero-homo binaries by promoting the following mantra to all organizations that employed its services. Trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are valid. This has since become a mantra of the Welsh Government. In 2006, Professor Emma Reynolds from Cardiff University, the person primarily responsible for the implementation of RSE teaching in Wales, had an article published in the British Journal of Sociology of Education. The article was titled, "They Won't Let Us Play Unless You're Going Out with One of Them. Girls, Boys and Butler's Heterosexual Matrix in the Primary Years." Professor Reynolds concludes her article with a mission statement. The heteronormativity of gender relations in the early years is certainly ripe for some gender trouble, and some of this work is well underway and radically disrupting a range of gender and sexual truths in what might be more fittingly described as the heteroformative years. In a book titled Girls, Boys and Junior Sexualities, Exploring Children's Gender and Sexual Relations in the Primary School, published in 2005, Professor Reynolds quotes academic Richard Johnson. Queer theory is linked to forms of politics which deliberately seek to break down the fixed boundaries between the hetero-homo, gender and other binaries, to multiply sexual categories and ultimately dissolve them. Queer theory is a praxis-driven philosophy that aims to multiply categories between binary oppositions with the goal of dissolving the boundaries. It aims to undermine social norms. Queer theory may have remained a widely ignored hobby of gender studies scholars were it not for the rise of social media, where it has turbocharged an ideological belief that we all have a gender identity that is independent of our biological sex. Two researchers, Shay Woolahan and Hannah Birelli, investigated the role of microblogging site Tumblr, popular with teenage girls in the mid-2010s, in the popularization of gender identities.
The most important theme on Tumblr during this era was disembodiment. You have to remember this as we start to go through all of these crazy gender and sexuality labels that came out of Tumblr during this era. Teenage girls are prone to disembodiment as they start to go through puberty and they experience things like sexualization and catcalling for the first time, and the body becomes a site of a lot of anxiety for teenage girls. The political ideology that they developed on Tumblr was therefore defined by a separation from the sex body and an intense amount of anxiety around sex and sexuality.
So Tumblr identity politics emphasized emotional fragility, and any challenge to these micro-identities, no matter how honest or sincere, was met with outrage. This was also the time that trigger warnings and safe spaces became very popular in universities. You might remember phrases like check your privilege and do better. It all came out of this time. And now many people might be thinking that these ideas aren't new. They're from academia, particularly gender studies departments, and you'd be right. But these ideas were made real in concrete on Tumblr. Teenage girls are not particularly good at nuance or philosophy or anything else because they're kids. So the complex theories laid out in Butler became really crude and simplified. Performing a gender meant literally being that gender in every sense, regardless of biological sex, sexuality, perception, appearance, anything else.
Butler's theories may have remained popular in postmodernist departments of universities, but the reason why gender identity ideology is so popular today and embedded in the third sector is because teenagers took their ideas and ran with them.
Young queer theory activists have certainly had a massive influence on the Welsh Government. In the glossary of their LGBTQ+ action plan, published in February 2023, the word gender was given only one definition, that derived from queer theory. In her 2005 book, Reynolds writes, "Queering childhood involves not just the queering of sex, gender, and sexual binary oppositions, such as male, masculinity, female, femininity, and heterosexual, homosexual, but also the generational binaries, adult-child, and sexual-asexual. In the RSE guidance on the Welsh Government website on designing your curriculum, the word sex is defined as attributed to a person on the basis of primary sex characteristics, genitalia, and reproductive functions, rather than being the distinction between male and female. The word gender is defined as often used to refer to whether someone identifies as female, male, or non-binary. A person cannot identify into a sex category. Sex is immutable. So it is a mandatory part of the RSE curriculum that schools seeks to undermine social norms using queer theory. Professor Reynolds has produced resources for schools to use to help with this task. These resources are interactive PDF documents that can be downloaded. Primary agenda is to be used for children between the ages of 7 and 11, and agenda for children between 11 and 18. These resources encourage children to explore their gender with the objective of multiplying categories between binary oppositions, with the goal of dissolving those binary oppositions. The resource encourages children to question their gender and to get beyond the binary. Many people believe there is a link between the promotion of queer theory teaching and the huge increase of the number of young people, particularly girls, who are seeking to medically change their bodies. One member of the Senedd who was brave enough to speak up about her concerns was Helen Mary Jones, who at a Women's Place UK meeting described how, despite her support for young people who identified as trans, she had reservations.
But that doesn't mean to say that over time I haven't experienced disquiet. I became concerned in my previous role about the numbers of young, non-gender conforming women, the girls that we would have called when I was young tomboys, who were feeling so uncomfortable with themselves that they felt that the only way to achieve that comfort, they couldn't be happy to be gender non-conforming girls, the only way that they could achieve that comfort with themselves was to transition to the opposite sex. And I began to wonder how much of that was just that, when people can talk more openly about these issues, people can be themselves, and just as we've seen with lesbian and gay people, they can come out and they can be themselves. How much of this rise, particularly in girls identifying as trans, was to do with that, it being easier for them to do it, and how much of it was to do with how incredibly difficult it is to be a teenage girl in our pornified, hideous culture where everything is photographed every 5 seconds, where if you don't get this number of likes on Instagram, where you are nothing, where you can't get away from the bullies at school because they'll find you at home on social media. I started to ask myself some questions. Wasn't my place to ask then those questions of those young people. But I think that those are some questions that we need to think about. We need to live in a world, I think, where we don't expect little girls to be this and little boys to be that. Children, young people, all of us ought to be allowed to be ourselves.
For taking this stance, Jones was monstered by gender revolutionaries, including former Mayor of Bangor, Owen Hurcomb. Other Senedd members have learned to keep quiet. Indeed, Plaid leader Adam Price ordered that all Plaid Cymru candidates for the last Senedd election undertake training from Gendered Intelligence. The CEO of Gendered Intelligence is Jay Stewart. Stewart is a lesbian but transitioned to a trans man in her mid-20s. In the book Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows, he declares, "Queer theory was the roadmap to my own self-understanding." Stewart explains the factors that caused him to seek transition.
I am a trans man, which means I was assigned female at birth, raised as a girl, and then later on in my mid-20s, I came to a kind of a realisation that I felt more masculine and that actually the word man was more applicable to me.
Both Brook and Gendered Intelligence intervened in support of the Tavistock and the legal challenge to the Keira Bell case against the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust. The type of training undertaken by Brook Learn can be viewed by creating an account on the Brook Learn website and logging in. Under Introduction to RSE, it states, identifying how to explore topics such as STIs, pleasure, and relationships and consent, whilst also outlining how you can engage young people in developing your curriculum. The associated useful resources include links to a UNESCO document, The Journey Towards a Comprehensive Sexuality Education, Brook Sex, Brook Porn, Brook Gender, full of the ideological language associated with gender identity ideology, Brook Difference between sex and gender. In line with Professor Reynolds' desire to queer sex and gender binaries, Brook suggests that both sex and gender exist on a spectrum. In 2014, Stonewall received a grant of $100,000 from the Arcus Foundation to integrate trans-specific work in all key campaigning and programming. In an interview with non-profit organisation Synagos, John Stryker, head of the Arcus Foundation and heir to the Stryker Corporation, a multi-billion-dollar medical corporation, explained a precondition of being awarded a grant. We also required that all grantees have a board-approved non-discrimination policy that includes sexual orientation and gender identity. This is not UK law, but the condition mandated by Arcus Foundation is the same condition being pushed to all organisations that have employed the services of Stonewall. Stonewall state, going above and beyond the law, the most inclusive services consider gender identity to be a protected characteristic. An organisation's position on the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index or Diversity Champion Scheme is entirely dependent on how well it implements Stonewall guidance. In line with John Stryker's instruction, it is now Welsh Government HR policy that there should be no discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So despite there being no scientific proof that it is true, pushing the belief that gender identity is innate and sex is on a spectrum is very useful for the queer theorist goal of queering the sex and gender binary. It is also useful for the techno-medical complex. As investigative journalist Jennifer Billick writes, sex as a spectrum, or human sex deconstructed into parts, works very well for the techno-medical complex and the Stryker Corporation, which sells medical supplies and surgical devices. As a species, we are much more profitable in parts than whole. Billick continues, Arcus Foundation, with its base in America and a subsidiary in the UK, is used as a philanthropic facade for the profits of Stryker Medical and the techno-medical complex in general, of which, as already mentioned, the founder of the Arcus Foundation is the heir. John Stryker used the Arcus Foundation, the largest LGBT non-governmental organisation in the world, to send $500 million of Stryker Corporation money worldwide to support gender identity. The Welsh Government are pushing a dangerous ideology. Gender ideology teaching in schools has been criticised by Welsh mothers, supported by a grassroots organisation, Public Child Protection Wales, many religious groups and the Pope. Those parents who would prefer that their child were not taught that sex and gender are spectrums may wish to consider supporting Public Child Protection Wales.